Hi, Purple Ella here and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about a difficult subject. Today I want to talk to you about bereavement and its impact on autistic people and how best to support autistic people who are bereaved. So I know that there's not a huge amount out there at the moment about autism and bereavement. I know this because I've given a talk on the topic, and when I was doing my research for that talk I couldn't find a huge amount of information, neither studies nor information on how best to support autistic people. So what I'm doing here is I'm basically taking my own personal life experience and the way that autism impacted on me, and I'm going to talk about that in hopes that it might be useful for someone else out there. So it is a difficult subject today, and I'm sorry about that, but I think it's important that we talk about the difficult subjects as well as the more light-hearted subjects. So my own personal experiences of bereavement. During the course of my life so far, I have lost. The two significant bereavements in my life have been my dad, who I lost in my early 20s, and my maternal grandmother, who I lost around 3 years ago. These losses were significant to me. They were people that were significant in my life, and so I feel like I have dealt with grief, and I have dealt with how that feels, and I have dealt with finding best ways to support myself with that. So that's what I'm going to use to inform what I talk to you about today. So the first thing to bear in mind when an autistic person loses someone in their lives is that their reaction to that loss might not be what you would expect it to be. Now, obviously, everyone's reaction to loss is different, autistic or not autistic. But I think autistic people might particularly struggle with knowing how to react to losing someone in their lives. I know that, for example, when I lost my dad, I think I was 22 when I lost my dad. So this was quite some time ago now. And I was at a music festival when I got that phone call, or maybe I was on my way. I was walking to a music festival with a group of my friends, and I got that phone call letting me know that my dad had passed away. It wasn't entirely unexpected. We knew that he was dreadfully ill about a week prior to him actually passing away, and it wasn't entirely uncomplicated in that my relationship with my dad was quite a complicated one, which I'm not going to get into with you guys. But basically, I received that phone call to let me know that he had sadly died, and my reaction was to carry on with my plan. It didn't occur to me to deal with this. I was on my way to a music festival. That was my plan. I was with my friends, so I went to that music festival and I did what I would do at that music festival. And I didn't actually take the time to process the fact that my father had died until the next day, when I'd got a free day and I felt like I could use that day to plan to deal with that. And that might sound heartless to you, that I went to a music festival and I carried on dancing and having a good time with my friends. But really, I just didn't know how to react to this situation, and I'm very attached to my plans and the way that I do things. So what I'm saying, I guess, is that if you tell someone that they've lost someone that's in their lives and it's an autistic person and they're in the middle of a routine or they're in the middle of a plan, it might not occur to them immediately to change that plan or to stop that routine. And don't think that that is heartless or that that means that they don't care. It's just that was the way that I dealt with that in that moment. The other thing that was probably slightly unusual in my reaction to losing my father was that I didn't believe it. This is going to sound awful, but I needed proof. I needed to see his body to prove to myself that he was dead. Until I had seen that, he wasn't dead. He could still exist. I couldn't wrap my head around the concept of him being dead without seeing physical evidence of that fact. Now, when my gran passed away, I was there, so I didn't need to have any further evidence. But when my dad died, because I wasn't in the area where he was living at that time, I hadn't seen him for quite a while. I needed proof, and I needed to see his body, which is what I did, and that was really useful, and that really helped me process that. Which brings me on nicely to the sort of emotions that are involved in grief. as we know, there are stages to grief that typically people go through. So there's shock, there's anger, there's sadness, there's depression. And these stages are typically passed through in roughly the same order. Now, for an autistic person trying to process those emotions around grief, this can be particularly difficult. So I personally believe that I also have alexithymia, which is the having difficulty with processing specific emotions anyway. So, for example, I don't necessarily recognise anger and jealousy and sadness as three separate emotions. So processing those emotions around grief was really difficult for me because it all just felt very, very overwhelming. I was flooded with emotions because of what had happened, but I didn't know how to identify those emotions, how to recognise what was happening and why it was happening, let alone how to deal with those emotions appropriately. So actually what ended up happening was a mental health crisis that took me many years to recover from. I believe now that had I known that I was autistic, had I known to expect not to know what these emotions were, and had I had support with identifying and working through those emotions, that mental health crisis may not have occurred, and I may have found that grieving process easier. So recognising that autistic people have difficulty recognising their own emotions is significant when it comes to thinking about grief. And in addition, recognising that autistic people have a hard time processing other people's emotions is also significant. So you might be really struggling with your own grief if you're not autistic, and the autistic person in your life may not be particularly sensitive to that unless it is spelled out to them exactly what you are going through. They may not instinctively know that you are grieving and instinctively know how you are feeling, and sometimes that might be really difficult to deal with. So I think it would be useful to have someone who maybe isn't you, who maybe is in a place where they can talk about that with the autistic person, to help the autistic person to understand not only their own emotions in relation to this situation, but also the emotions of the people around them and how best to handle the people around them who are having these emotions at this time. In addition to that, grief is likely to increase an autistic person's autistic traits. So sensory issues may become more significant. Meltdowns may become more frequent. Shutdowns may become more frequent. Executive functioning may deteriorate. The autistic person may struggle to remember to eat and to wash and to take care of themselves and to sequence and to do things. So grief can cause autism to affect the autistic person, the traits of autism to affect the autistic person more significantly. I know for me what that looked like was really struggling with executive functioning around the time that my dad had died, and I think people assumed that I was depressed, and actually looking back on it, I don't think that I was depressed. I think that I was losing executive functioning skills as a result of processing grief. So I didn't think to shower, and I didn't think to wash, and I could not figure out how to approach washing up. For example, my sensory issues increased. Noises were too loud, the world was too fast, everything was way, way too much. So expecting that might be helpful in terms of preparing and planning for that. So the other area to consider around autism and grief is the funeral. Funerals are very, very difficult. They're social occasions. You need social skills to manage a funeral. You need to know to dress appropriately. You need to know how to react at a funeral, how to behave at a funeral. There is a social kind of expectation of how you will behave at a funeral, how you will interact with other people, how you will react to the funeral. And I found that very difficult because I'm autistic. So I think there's also some value ahead of the funeral in sitting down with the autistic person, or if you are the autistic person, sitting down yourself and thinking about what a funeral looks like. If possible, being fully informed. Is it going to be a cremation? Is it going to be a burial? Is there going to be a wake? Where will the wake be held? What kind of food will be at the wake? Is it something that you can eat, or do you need to take along some food that's going to feel safe? So almost preparing for that funeral in the same way that you would prepare an autistic person for any other event. If you can get pictures of where the funeral is going to be held, that might be useful. So really, it's something that you might not think about at that time, but treat the funeral for the autistic person as you would treat any other event, and support them in the way that you would support them for any other event. So whether that's a schedule of what's going to happen, whether that's preparing in terms of clothing, we're expected to wear particular clothing at funerals. Can you be flexible about that? Can you find a compromise where the autistic person can be comfortable but still dressed appropriately? So really just thinking about preparing for the funeral. In terms of the actual bereavement itself, obviously, if the death is unexpected, there's nothing that you can do about that, and you're really just going to be dealing with the aftermath of that. But if you're expecting a death in your family or in your circle, if you can prepare, think about what you can tell the person about the situation so that this does not come out of the blue, so that they are prepared for the death. That's going to be useful. The other thing that I would say is we use a lot of really woolly language around death, and that's partly to protect ourselves, but it's really not helpful for someone who struggles with unclear language. So he's passed away, he's gone to a better place, he is no longer with us. All these kinds of expressions are going to be really confusing for autistic people. He's passed away. Where's he passed away to? He's gone to a better place. Where has he gone, and can I go and see him? I would advise that you use very specific language. He has died. That means that he is no longer alive. He is no longer breathing. He is no longer with us because he is going to be buried, because he is dead. I'm really struggling to find an appropriate way to say this, but basically what I'm saying is if you can kind of ditch the platitudes and the woolly language that we use around death when you're talking to an autistic person about death, that will make it much clearer, and also prevent multiple questions from the autistic person who isn't really entirely sure about what has happened to the person in their lives that has died. So, for me personally, it took me several years to process my dad's death, because it was unexpected, because it was a complicated relationship, because it was the first significant death in my life, and because it was a parent, and I was relatively young to lose a parent, and because I didn't really have anyone to talk to about that situation who knew him, because the people that were in my life at that point didn't know him. So that was really difficult. The other thing that I think was difficult around his death, that might be difficult because of my autism, was that at the funeral, lots of people were saying things about him that didn't match up with what I knew about him and how I felt about him, and so I kind of felt like they were lying about him, and that's not true. They weren't lying about him, but at funerals we tend to talk about the person that has died in a certain way. We tend to highlight their strengths and downplay their weaknesses, and that's a natural and normal and healthy thing to do, but that can be quite difficult for an autistic person who tends to say it how it is. So that's another thing to bear in mind. My grand's death was a little bit easier to deal with, although I loved her very, very much. She was a really, really important and significant person in my life. I had had a really straightforward and good relationship with her, and her death wasn't unexpected, and I had time to prepare for it, and she had a good life, and she lived a good number of years, and so for me as an autistic person it was easier to process that she was old and she died, and that makes sense in my kind of universe. And that's really all I have to say on this topic, I think. If you have any questions about what I've said today, please leave me a comment in the comment box below. If you'd like me to elaborate on anything specifically that I've talked about today, then leave me a comment in the comment box below, and I will do my very best to respond to that. I hope this video has been useful. I know it's not been cheery. I know it's not been a particularly easy thing to hear about. It's certainly not been a particularly easy thing to talk about, but I have actually been asked by lots of people to talk about this. So I'm hoping that it will be useful. If it has been useful, please share it, because as I've said, there's not a huge amount out there on this topic, so it might be useful to someone else. And I'll be back next week. Thanks for watching. Bye.